When I applied for fellowship, it took a while before I got my first interview. And even after getting my first interview, it still took some time before interviews started coming. But during the time when I was expecting interviews, there was one thing I still did, and that was to prepare for interviews. Although I didn't have interviews, I started preparing with my friends. And that was one of the single most important things that I did while waiting for interviews. And the reason for this is because a lot of your interviews will come, but they only give you a few dates. And that's because AMGs get the first wave of interviews. And then the second waves that they send out to IMGs have limited dates. So sometimes you might just get a week notice and you have to show up and do your best. In this video, I'm going to be going through the commonest questions that I was asked and various ways that they were phrased. I'm going to also talk about questions that threw me off balance and the questions that I didn't see coming. But let's get to it. Hi, my name is Endurance. I'm a cardiology fellow. So I think the first question, and the question that everybody knows about, is tell me about yourself. And that question, every single person asks the question. Get asked that question so many times, you get sick of the question. So how I usually start, I'll talk about my background, the things that spur me to come to the US, and how I came to become interested in cardiology. So I'll say, my name is Endurance. I trained in Nigeria, and when I was back in Nigeria, I was in the ED for about 3-4 years. When I was in the ED, I had a lot of patients that had cardiovascular disease, and that led me to become very interested in cardiovascular health. During my time in the ED, that I realized that there was a lot of burden of cardiovascular disease back in my country. And so I decided to pursue an internal medicine residency. I came to the US, and now my goal is to be able to train and use the knowledge to improve cardiovascular health. The second question that almost everybody asked me was, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they asked it in various different ways. Is there any specific parts of cardiology that you're interested in? Some say your plans for the future. What do you want to be when you grow up? And I find it interesting because I'm already telling you that I want to do cardiology. I don't know what you want me to tell you again. Anyways, I kind of was to talk about the things within cardiology that I like to do, but I also kept an open mind to let them know that, I think I'm very interested in heart failure. But the reason for that is just because my experience has been a lot of heart failure patients, and I have had fantastic mentors who are also heart failure attendants. So naturally, I kind of, lean towards heart failure. But during cardiology fellowship, I think the whole idea is to just keep an open mind from day one, learn as much as possible, and see where my interest lies. That is how I approached it. So the caveat depends on the kind of program. If you are interviewing a program that is highly research heavy, they want you to talk about specific areas. Like they don't want you to talk about general cardiology for some reason, which doesn't make sense. So they want you to niche down and talk about, I'm interested in amyloidosis, I'm interested in heart failure. So I interviewed the program, and when we were in the program, they asked us, what is everybody interested in cardiology? I said heart failure, and people talked about what the areas they are interested in. There were particular people who were so specific. Somebody said cardiac amyloidosis imaging, and I'm like, okay, what is that? We'll see those kind of people. I don't know if that's the way to go, but from my general sense, that is what the programs are looking for. They're looking for people who have already niched down even before starting cardiology fellowship. I think that's counterintuitive, but it was just my experience, man. Next question, tell me about your research. Now, this question is broad because some programs talked about just tell me about your research and your research experience. A few programs will ask me a specific question, like a specific research. Tell me about this XYZ research. But the majority just said, tell me about your research. And the way it happened is if the program director is research heavy, then you are likely to get a research specific question. If they are not research heavy, then you will get an umbrella research question. So anytime you are going to a program, you should have an idea of who you are meeting, because that will shape the question in a way. If the program director is a general cardiologist, it's likely to welcome the idea of being a general cardiologist. But if the program director is more of a specialist/researcher, they are likely to be biased towards planning a subspecialty fellowship for people who love research. So this is the biases you have to just note in your head. Another question was about what I wrote in my personal statement, and most of the interviewers said, it looks like you have plans to go back to your country. Is that correct? Tell me about that a little bit. That's one thing I have to let you guys know. If you write stuff in your personal statement, you have to be able to talk about them. And for me, I do have plans of going back to Nigeria. I just don't know what the plans are yet. So you have to at least come up with something you can talk about, because I wasn't prepared for the first question, but I was able to navigate the answer. Subsequently, I had an idea of what I wanted to say when that question came up. And that question came up quite often, which leads me back to my point. Your personal statement actually is very looked upon. The questions I got, a few of them came directly from my personal statement. There was another question from my personal statement when I talked about working with some of my attendants, and that specific statement led to a question of, tell me about your rotations and tell me about the experience of medical residents when they are rotating in the imaging departments. So you should definitely look to your personal statement, because it can generate questions that may throw you off. Another interesting thing is, even after asking you what do you want to be when you grow up, they also still ask you why cardiology, which I found quite interesting, because I think I already answered that question in what do you want to be when you grow up, but they still ask me why cardiology. So I don't know. Personally, talked about it from just my experience back home, my experience with patients, and how that led me to come to the US. Now, these questions are very common, but one problem that I kind of found out during my interview trail was that most of the faculty and interviewers wanted me to give them a strong reason why I was going to leave my location. It was a big deal. It was more than I anticipated. So they asked questions like, why this program? Also asked, why would you want to come to this program? Missouri is far, because I did my residency in Missouri. Missouri is far away from here. Why do you want to come here? I don't understand what the right or wrong answer is, but I think maybe you want to show ties if you have. Maybe you want to talk about fellows in their program that have talked to you about how fantastic their program is, or maybe you want to talk about having met a few of them during your ACC conference and something like that. But the programs, they are very, very conscious of the distance from area within the country that you're in. So sometimes they want you to give them a very convincing answer as to why you would leave your current location and come to theirs. One of my interviewers, the program director, had showed me a map of where all their fellows had come from in the past, and there was nobody from Missouri. So the question was, why would you come since nobody has ever come from Missouri? And I was like, oh, just rank me, I'll be there. But another frequently asked question was, what do you do outside of medicine? Quite honestly, that's pretty straightforward to answer for everybody. It's more about asking you, what do you do for wellness? What do you do for hobbies? We're trying to just assess, are you easy to work with? Are you someone who is outgoing? I think everybody should be able to answer this question. When I was answering this question, I tried to bring the element of family. Maybe watch Netflix, but also, watch Netflix with my family. And then the question became, oh, tell me about your family. Do you have kids? That kind of softened the arena. If you have family, you can definitely use that. Another question that I got, but not too often, was, tell me about your experience as being a third-year chief resident. So I got this question asked, and the way they always asked the question was they knew that I was a third-year chief resident, and they always wondered what it was like, because most people that were interviewing me talked about being chief residents but in their fourth year. So that my interviewers, some of them were chiefs, but they were fourth-year chiefs. So they were, how do you cope as being a third-year chief? That is pretty straightforward. I explained it to them. Like, being a chief resident in your third year is kind of tough, and the reason for that is because most of your colleagues that you started residency with are now your friends, and so it's difficult to have that boundary of when am I being a chief versus when am I being my friend's friend, that kind of stuff. And for those of you who are chief residents in your third year, that question will pop up. And I'm guessing for people who are also in their fourth year chief resident, that question will also pop up. So just being a chief resident may come with a few questions. And then they asked about what are the things that I learned from being a chief resident. Being a chief resident kind of gives you an understanding of the fact that we are physicians, but we're still humans. So right now, the intention of this video is to have the questions and the thought process behind the questions. The way I answered the questions themselves, I'm not able to go into the details just because it's going to make a whole long video. And if you want me to go through those questions, especially the top 5 or top 3 questions, just let me know in the comment section. You can definitely go very deeply into that in another video. One of the things that I did just preparing for interviews is that I had a box that I kept beside my computer. And before I go for an interview, I would look up the people interviewing me, because most programs send you the name of your interviewers, and I'll write 3-4 questions that I wanted to ask them. I'll put the sticky notes on the box beside the computer, and during my interviews, when I had a break, I'll just go glance it. The way I came up with those questions and the questions that I asked, I'm going to talk about also in another video. So just make sure to subscribe and leave a comment in the comment section if you had any specific questions you wanted to ask. Research by far had the most questions asked, to be honest. And I know I talked about saying, tell me about your research, but the questions are actually in bundle. When they start by asking you, tell me about your research, they usually ask questions that follow up. Tell me about your research. That is one. The next thing that they will ask was, what brought about the idea of the research? That's another question they ask you. And they will now ask you another question that comes up after that question is, what are the plans for the research? Now, a few people will say, what's the clinical implication? But most people say, what are the plans for this research? What I typically did was, after the first few interviews, I realized that those questions came up. So when I am talking about the research, I talk about what we did in the research, what we found in the research, what I plan now. We plan on using a more granular database, because the limitations from our previous study was the database that we used had so many limitations. We are querying more interesting database, and from there we're able to make very interesting conclusions. One thing I tried to do was to let my mentors know that I was going for this interview, especially if I was very interested in that program. And now let's talk about the weird questions that I got, questions that I didn't expect. First question was, what's your patient cap? I'm like, okay, what does that even mean? What's my patient cap? Anyways, yes, you have to answer. Just know that few programs can ask you that question. What is your patient cap? And for me, it was just like unsettling. And I gave them a number, and I hope that number was okay. And it's interesting because in that same interview, they asked me another question that blew my mind away. And they said, if you have a disgruntled patient who is stable but is asking to see you, and you also have new patients who are waiting to be seen, how do you handle that situation? I said that I will quickly pop my head into the room of the patient that was disgruntled and let them know that, oh, I'm sorry I haven't been able to see you. I have to go and see other patients right now, but I will do my best to come back and see you as soon as possible. The idea is to diffuse the patient's worry by acknowledging how they feel and letting them know that you are aware and will be back to try and fix it. Another question that I got, and this one completely threw me off. So like I said, if the program is heavy on research, you talk about research, right? So I talked about research and how much I would like to do research in the future. But the next question that came up was, what is your business model? What is that? The interviewer was like, well, you see, in cardiology, you can make up to over $500,000, right? So why would you want to do so much research if you can make money? So I guess the question is, if you do so much research, how do you want to pay the bills? And honestly, I didn't have an answer for that. I was really stunned. In fact, my wife was in the background and she was laughing. Oh boy, the question blew my mind. So while you are talking about your research, you want to make it as realistic as possible. From that day on, I started talking about my research in a 70% clinical. That's the way to go. That question just blew my mind, man. And I knew that I was not going to match in that program, 100%. Because that person asking this question was the chair, right? Was the chief, or something like that. So I knew 100% I was not matching that program. Don't make that mistake. Another strange question that I got was, can you tell me about the things that you did to get this kind of letter of recommendation? Now, I don't know exactly what the letter of recommendation said, so I'm not sure. I had no answer. Also asked about, tell me about your weakness. Now, I don't know why my weakness is interesting to anybody, but what I try to show is that I'm aware of my weakness and that I'm working on my weakness. My personal weakness is taking up too much work that I cannot do. So I said, well, I'm very aware that I take up too much work. And this is what I've been struggling with for a long time. I spoke with my mentor about it, and he told me that he also struggles with the same thing. But that what I can do is start saying no so that I can have more time to work on the things that I care about the most. So right now I'm trying to say no more, although I still struggle with that. And interestingly, they kept asking about my hobbies. It came up every single time. In my CV, I had written that I was interested in karaoke, but I also wrote that I wrote that I was interested in chess and other stuff. See, what was talked about was karaoke. And so that came up very, very, very frequently. Now, I didn't sing during my interview. I didn't sing because I am very terrible at singing, actually. I just like karaoke, but they will ask you about that, especially if it resonates with them. How I said it was, well, myself and my colleagues, every once in a while we go out, then we sing at the karaoke. So that's something I like doing because it's something we do together as, groups of colleagues. Just letting them know I'm a chill guy, and at the same time, I'm very social. So that's the whole idea. You want to use the story to give yourself a persona. Try not to look stiff like a very nerdy cardiologist. Nah. Another very unsettling question was the question about how much volume do you guys have in your program? What do we have? I'm like, bro, what the heck is wrong with you guys? Anyways, so that came up quite like 3 or 4 times. Another very weird question was how many months of rotation did you get? How many months of inpatient? How many central lines? How many months of ICU rotation? I was wondering how that's related. How many femoral lines have I put in? Which didn't make sense to me. But these questions were asked. And I actually talked with my colleagues who also got asked these questions in different programs. So I think it's kind of one of those strange questions that you have to be ready for. For me, it just completely threw me off. I didn't even know how to answer what the volume like to begin with. It's pretty decent, good number of patients. Obviously, come prepared with that question. I just answered the questions spontaneously. And that's one of the things you definitely get questions that are asked spontaneously. And another it wasn't a weird question, it was a weird answer. When they asked me, what are you interested in? What do you want to be when you grow up? I said heart failure. And immediately I could see the countenance of the program director. He was like, oh, we don't have a strong heart failure experience here. I don't know we are a good fit for you. I think we can offer you other experiences, but heart failure, we're not so strong here because, our heart failure department is still growing. So you could tell that I completely blundered this interview. At that point, I knew, like, oh my goodness, what have I done? So you have to look at the strength of the program. Do not go talking about LVAD when those programs don't do that stuff. Another interesting question was Drake versus Kendrick Lamar. I'm like, okay, I chose Drake. Oh boy. You'd be like, no, I don't match. You guys like, oh no, Kendrick Lamar. I'm like, I also knew that I committed a blunder. Thinking about it now, it's quite funny. But when I was interviewing, it wasn't funny at all. But generally, what I kind of got to understand is that during this interview process, they're just looking to connect with you. A few of them are looking to size you up, but for the most part, they are just looking to who are they able to connect with, whose goals aligns with theirs. I think just showing up and be at ease. By practicing mock interviews, you will have answers that will flow naturally. If you've practiced those responses, it's less intimidating. So I would say that one of your biggest weapon you can do right now is to just practice be as laid back as possible, but just think about the responses, right? I didn't go through all the questions I was asked. I possibly cannot go through them. But I put a document of all the questions that I was asked, about 25 questions. It's in the link. You can download that for free. And let me know in the comment sections what specific questions you have. In my future videos, I'll talk about the specific answers that I give programs, especially when they said, tell me about yourself, why this program? Because those questions, I'll talk about the top 5 questions and I will exhaustively give my answers to them and why I chose those answers. That is because all those top 5 questions were asked in all my interviews. So be sure to subscribe so we can keep you updated. And as usual, I'll see you in the next one.